So last week was fellowship.
Jesus Christ.
This week is forgiveness.
Hello and welcome to A God We Could Believe In, a frank and honest look at Christianity as we find it today. We're going to be looking at the things the church says and does that are embarrassing, confusing, or even downright offensive. In other religious contexts, your questions might be forbidden, but not here. So whether you're a lifelong churchgoer with the scars to prove it, or you've never entered a church and are just interested in the debate, this is a safe space for you. In that spirit, we're diving headlong into questions of sex and relationships, covering topics from marriage and purity to sexuality and masturbation. We'll be looking at issues of sexual relationships, abuse, gender and identity, so listener discretion is advised. Please look after yourselves. In today's Q&A episode, we're answering your questions on our last episode, The Binfire Rages On. Feel free to give that a listen first if you haven't already. We'll also be discussing our recent bonus episode with sex educator Lauren Jackson on how to talk to young people about sex. I'm Tim Woodson, and today I'm joined by biblical scholar Charlotte Naylor Davis, practical theologian Simon Hall, and poet, former social worker and daughter of Simon, Rachel Hall. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Q&A session in response to episode 4, which is The Binfire Rages On, the episode where Simon took us through the wonderful history of attitudes towards marriage in the church, certainly in the church in the West, through the last 2 millennia. So, and we've got Charlotte here today, who was missing in action for that one. So great, but you've had a chance to listen, Charlotte.
I have, yes. Well done, Simon, for covering so much and jumping us through. That was no mean feat. And everyone can utilize Google to fill in the gaps.
Well, this is it. Do your own research, kids. Before we crack into the sort of Q&A on that bit, though, we wanted to pick up on some feedback from our episode before that, which was the last full episode, which was your episode, Charlotte, on marriage in the Bible as a binfire. Now, we managed to get through that whole episode and not mention anything that Jesus says about it. Yeah. And a few eagle-eared listeners happened to sort of pipe up that, which is, completely great. We welcome that kind of feedback. So, Charlotte, do you want to maybe pick this up then?
Yeah. So it's funny, isn't it? I was trying to figure out, why didn't I talk about Jesus and Paul? And it was because what I was trying to do in that episode, I think, was just disrupt this idea that it's really clear in the Bible. There's only one way of doing marriage, and it's really obvious, and anyone who reads the Bible should be able to pick up on it. And so I didn't go for kind of constructing a new teaching on what's happening or what Jesus and Paul are saying, although we did talk about Paul. So yeah, let's talk about Jesus. So I guess the thing that people pick up on is Matthew 19, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Which is good. I'm really happy for people to pick up on Matthew 19 because it says some really interesting stuff about gender in the whole of this discussion. So For those people who really want to be literal about what Jesus says about marriage and divorce, you're going to have to be literal about there being loads of genders in the Bible as well. So that's good. Look forward to that in the episode on gender.
Great.
Jesus uses this phrase that a man will leave his family and become one flesh with his wife. And so I don't think at any point I was trying to say that either Jesus or Paul don't think that marriage is important or that having sex isn't a thing that seems to unify two people together. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that is what Jesus thinks. But he doesn't tell us much more. What he tells us is that divorce is not a thing that's okay.
Right.
And so then we're back into this thing of how do we negotiate with this text? Because most churches give license for divorce.
So it says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee. Large crowds followed him. He healed them there. Some Pharisees came to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?"
The question is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? So that's what Jesus is talking about, is divorce. And Jesus says no, essentially. Haven't you read? Actually, what he says is what Jesus does often, which he goes, haven't you read this thing? So he repeats the law back to people. And he does what he often does, particularly in Matthew, which is take what is Jewish practice at the time, which is that people can be divorced, and it is okay for a man to divorce a wife pretty much kind of whenever he wants to. The women don't get a choice. And he says, no, actually, you need to go further than just what you think the law says. And you need to go back to this idea that in the beginning, the Creator made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two but one. Therefore, what has God joined together, let no one separate. And everyone is quite shocked by this because they're saying, but Moses said it's okay to divorce. And he says, yeah, well, Moses allowed you that because you were pretty much rubbish at kind of keeping to the law, to what's natural and what's good. But now I'm telling you to do more. It's very much in that vein of, is it okay to hate our enemies? No, you need to go one further. You need to love your enemies. You need to do more than the law commands. And Jesus is really strong on it. As a divorced person, this is a really hard passage for me. Right? Jesus is really quite extreme. And he's going kind of in line with the most kind of extreme teaching at the time, this idea that maybe you just never can divorce anyone. And it's so shocking that in the text, the disciples are shocked by it. The disciples are like, well, if this is the case, then no one would ever get married. Like, if you're going to say this, who's ever going to be able to live by that? Like, it's a shocking teaching. The point of the teaching, I think, is a protection of women teaching.
Right.
So again, at the time, you can divorce your wife. You don't even really have to go to a religious leader to divorce your wife. You can just be like, I divorce you. And a woman is left, and she's left destitute. I think we talked about the story of Tamar being left destitute after her husband died in the Marriage's Binfire episode. So Jesus here is extending the law to something that then will keep women safe and keep them kind of holy. And he uses this phrase. I think that makes sense in the way that he understands people being joined together. But there's nothing in that quote from Genesis that makes it only one man and one woman, right? Jesus isn't going, and therefore nobody ever in the Old Testament was married to more than one woman. He's just using this idea of marriage and being together as the most important thing, and therefore you can't throw your wife away. So that's where we're at, is a kind of like, you can't throw your wife away. This is really important.
Someone was asking me today about the following episode and how come I knew such a weird scattergun collection of elements about marriage and British law around marriage. And it was actually because I did some research for my wife, Anna, to do with a film around Muslim marriage. And I think the passage from Genesis and why it's being quoted, I think is really good to read in the context of a kind of culture that we don't live in, particularly white British, people, where a young bride is brought into the husband's family effectively as a servant. So the teaching of Jesus basically, which is at the times to men, women couldn't get divorced. So Jesus is talking to men specifically. You can't divorce your wife for burning the dinner or because she displeases you or because you want to marry someone else. So he's protecting the woman. But he's also pointing out this idea that it's the man that leaves his family and establishes a new family. The image is not of a woman brought into the man's household as a servant of that household. And I think that's something that we don't notice. But in patriarchal systems, that's often the way. The woman leaves her family, often with a dowry, to pay for her own family have to pay for her support in the new family. And so you can read this whole conversation about marriage as Jesus trying to liberate women from a very oppressive patriarchal system.
So one question on that then, I guess, is why does Jesus say except for sexual immorality? When it says, I will tell you, anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Like, why is that the important thing in that context, I guess?
I'm going to let Charlotte answer that one because there's the taking it as it appears version and there's did the original text include that version?
There's always reasons why you're allowed to divorce people. And kind of sexual immorality in this context would be sex outside of marriage. Anything outside of that would be classed as adultery. So sexual immorality can mean lots and lots of things in the first century. Mainly what we're talking about here is that the wife is going to be committing adultery or doing something that the man considers to be excessive usually. Sexual immorality, by the way, could kind of count as anything from putting herself in a way that means that the man seems to be more kind of penetrated rather than penetrator. So a woman taking too much control or anything like that. There's loads of things that count as sexual immorality, but here we're really talking about something that's going on for some reason brings the marriage vows into disrepute. And therefore, that's the thing. Because it's this idea that Jesus is basing it around is about the two of you being together as one flesh. So everybody who has queried in our Q&A is right. Like that is what Jesus is doing. He's referring to Genesis and saying, look, there's a unity in sexual activity here that should be primary and should be only between a husband and a wife.
Mm-hmm.
I still stand by what I said about Genesis, that isn't necessarily just one man and one woman. It's nearly always only one woman with one. The woman only gets one man, but multiple women are allowed in this setup from Genesis onwards. Right. But by the time we get here, this is monogamy. That's pretty standard for the era, is this idea of monogamy now, and we're only going to marry one person. And Jesus is saying, look, this sexual bond that you have is primary, not whether you want your wife around anymore, not whether you just happen to like her anymore. And back to some of the stuff that Simon was talking about, kind of like if a child has happened, then this is it now. You're in, you're stuck. You can't just leave. You can't just leave women with a baby. So I think Jesus probably is holding up a really high bar for marriage here, massively high. That is, you can never break this off unless somebody commits adultery. Paul's going to use the same verse later on in Corinthians. And again, we're back to a sort of idea of a spiritual and physical union happening in sex. But I guess my caveat of why I didn't kind of mention it as like, there's just one really easy way to do marriage from the Bible. It's this verse about one flesh, is that the social setup that is happening in looks nothing like ours.
Right.
And so for me, there's a bit of a worry of just taking these two things of saying, well, there's this thing about how two flesh become one, very Spice Girls, that means that everything else is out of the way. If you've had sex with someone once, that's it. You're joined forever, which is the implication. Again, if we want to read this verse literally, and I know that we talked about kind of the things we taught as sex education and were taught by churches, I was definitely taught that if you had sex with anyone, you in some way were bonded to them, and that was marriage, right? And one of the reasons for using that, I think, in the first century is very similar to the stuff that Simon was talking about kind of being betrothed and being together, is there's not a marriage ceremony that needs to happen. There's a commitment and a covenant and an action that needs to happen, and that's what makes you married. And everybody around you would be like, right, well, if you're having sex with that person, take responsibility, because babies will come. So you're married now. Like there's this line that we have of a registry of marriage where we do a ceremony and we make plans and we do all of that isn't happening here. So what else is making you married to someone? Well, it's this one thing. And again, I don't think it's how we particularly think about sex and relationships socially anymore, let alone kind of set them up. But that is the implication for both Paul and Jesus, I think. Maybe we can get away from that. I think people maybe were worried that I was sort of denying that there's any sense of Paul and Jesus thinking that sex is important. And that's not it at all.
No.
For me, it's just, is this a model we can just simply take out of this one verse and say, right, well, that's it then. Off you go. Especially as with this passage, like I say, this is about divorce. And I promise people listening, I take this stuff really seriously. I'm divorced and it wasn't where I wanted to end up in my life. This is not me being blasé about things. It's a genuine well, how do we now live? Jesus is addressing his social situation and saying the primary thing here is you have to look after the people that you've taken spiritual responsibility for. And you as a man have taken spiritual responsibility for this woman. And now my question is, right, how do we take responsibility spiritually, physically, emotionally for people? But it's not, I promise I'm not just throwing it away.
So a couple of weeks ago, we released an episode with Lauren Jackson, who is a sex educator who goes into schools and talks about sex with young people. And Simon and Charlotte, you weren't there for that. So just wondered, how did you find it?
I mean, I thought it was great. There was so many good things in there. I loved the idea of kind of should stories.
Yeah.
That really hit for me, of these things that we carry around with us and that we're taught and we pick up, we carry around and we form things around them, which means that none of us are really thinking clearly all the time, are we, about sex and relationships. when we're making choices, I need to go away and analyze my own thinking.
Yeah, I actually reached out to Lauren on social media because I was also struck by this idea of should stories. And I said, let's have a question, because I think I heard you say, if you're not ready to talk to your partner about sex and what you do and don't want to do, I don't think you're ready to have sex. I said, isn't that a should story? And she said, oh, that's really interesting. Thank you. I've gone back to the research, and actually at what this person is primarily talking about from a different context is the should stories of you should be having sex by this age and you should be doing this to your partner. So a slightly different context, but it's very much a defining narrative of this is what sex must look like for it to be, socially acceptable. So I think the abstinence story followed by the, then you get married and, turn everything up to 11. That is a should story. She was saying, so maybe there are some boundaries, there are some should nots. Because I think one of the things that I thought was interesting, which we're going to come back to later in this series, is this much broader notion of what good sex is, that Lauren really has a very sort of healthy, deep and developed idea of what good sex is. It's not just, we just want to keep the young people safe. We just want to teach them about consent. So she said, I think it's just this idea that people are controlled by narratives of how they should behave. Of course, there are boundaries. Of course, there are ideals and role models, but that young people, the last thing that they need is people saying, oh, your first sexual experience should be like this. And this is how you should, treat your sexual partner or whatever. So I found that a helpful, explanation.
And I think one of the things as well, when we were talking about it in our kind of group chat afterwards, I think we were talking about that kind of understanding that sex has to be emotionally safe as well as physically safe.
Yeah.
I thought that was a great phrase, emotionally safe.
Yeah.
I was driving whilst I was doing it. I kept having to pause so I could gather my thoughts. I thought emotionally safe was really interesting, given some of the stuff that we've talked about in this series and are going to talk about, of how do we, from a Christian perspective, or can we, make those situations that are emotionally safe. And I definitely feel like a lot of people in churches aren't given that. And particularly, I can only speak kind of from a female perspective, but the prioritizing of virginity, but also the prioritizing of sex being a sort of service, a thing that you give to someone, that you do as a sacrifice, all this kind of makes you really emotionally unsafe, because you're not asked to connect your emotions to it. The ideal is that you connect your emotions to it, obviously, and I know that was put across to me in lots of ways. But the other thing is that actually, if you haven't got language, if you haven't got ways to talk about things, can you ever really be safe in that way with someone? And how do you build that as well? Which again should be something that churches could be quite good at, because we're meant to be quite good at emotions and things
And I think for me it was that kind of further understanding of the language actually has to be quite extensive, because I think what we're told is that what you should feel is that you love this person and you should trust this person, and we're just sort of expected to understand what that means. But we actually need to go deeper and go, well, no, for each person the feeling of safety is different, and how you feel anchored in your body is different, and how you feel present is different. That's been really useful for me of I just thought I should have sex with somebody that I loved, but I love lots of people in lots of different ways. And I think having somebody like Lauren in schools to help people kind of expand that narrative and that language is really important.
I felt like if I'd had people with that sort of maturity and that perspective around me as a teenager, and I think if I'd had the, spiritual and emotional flexibility to accommodate, to sort of listen to that, to take that messaging in, then I think I would have certainly been a lot more relaxed about the idea of sex in the relationships that I was in. I mean, it's funny actually talking about like because again, should stories was a really big thing for me as well. But like looking at like when you take that into passages like the one we talked about earlier about divorce, when you take those should stories in there and you think like, you know, again, I really remember this teaching drilled into me about, you know, if you have sex with someone, then you're committed for life. Because if you divorce, you know, you have sex, then you're basically married. So like then if you divorce, then like, and I took that literally. The way that Jesus talks about it, I took it literally. I took it seriously. I took it literally, and it was damaging.
Yeah. And it doesn't give any flexibility for what happens if that just isn't the way that things work out in your life. Yeah. What if you don't become a Christian until later? And you have children already with somebody outside of marriage, or there's a kind of, well, you can never get rid of that, right? Like you can never then get rid of this idea. Like it's a kind of, maybe this is cosmically what's going on. I don't know. I don't want to make any rules that it can or can't be. But the idea that somehow if life doesn't work perfectly and you don't get married and have sex with one person, and then forever only that person, that you're somehow spiritually linked to your partner, which is a thing that lots of my friends were taught, is very, very damaging as a teaching. It's so damaging to think that you are carrying around a spiritual link with someone. The word was soul ties when I was growing up. Yeah. Right? But it's a horrible idea, partly because nothing in this sort of teaching that takes account of sexual violence being done to you against your will. Mm-hmm. And in this teaching, and I was definitely handed this, there's an idea that somehow you're still linked to that person, even if it wasn't consensual, because it's just about the bodies coming together. That's, you've taken sexual encounter down to this tiny bracket, which is just bodies smashing together. At which point, again, what are we loading this with? We need to be very, very careful as teachers. I'm talking sort of to me and Simon, I guess, here, that even if something may be theologically a really lovely idea, that when it's put across, it's put across in a way that allows people to be safe in lots and lots of ways. It can't just be that you just parrot, well, Jesus says when a man leaves a woman and the two flesh become one, and so that's what sex is, it's marriage, done. Because that is being used across the world in various places to make people get married who really shouldn't. Who shouldn't be married or who can't consent to marriage, but this thing has happened, which is how it was for plenty of history. I mean, some of the times that, that Simon was talking about, if you had sex with a woman, then you're going to be expected to marry her. Or worse, she's never going to get to marry anyone because now she's soiled goods, People who've watched the first series of Bridgerton will understand this. But it seems quite extreme in Bridgerton, but it's not that extreme.
Right.
No, it's pretty extreme in the Old Testament. If you rape your neighbour's daughter, then,
she has to marry you.
Especially if she gets pregnant, then, the rape victim is obliged to marry her rapist. So
I think just like speaking as the person in the group with probably the least like biblical knowledge, I find stuff like this so tricky because it feels so at odds of like what I think I know Jesus or the concept of Jesus to be, and like, from being a child and thinking of like Jesus as kind of, the physical embodiment of love, if you will, and then to think about, a command in a way that issues such control over people. And, I agree with Charlotte. I'm thinking about it from a context of like marrying somebody that hurts you, like putting yourself in a safe situation, and like almost the kind of fear of judgment, fear of hell, fear of, whatever Christians are ruled by in terms of like, if we don't follow the rules, then this really awful thing is going to happen. That we think that is scarier than staying in a kind of real world physical situation or, an emotional situation that is actually quite scary in and of itself. And I just find it's just tricky that like to think about Jesus as controlling, he's commanding something, and I'm kind of like, he's giving out ideals here, but we're all flawed people, and how much does he actually expect us to stick to this? I just find it so I find it really tricky.
I think it's some of the stuff that I said in the Marriage is a Binfire episode about kind of Ephesians 5 and that household setup, that that what's happening all the way along in generally when people are writing scripture of any sort is a modification of what's happened before. And again, it's not that there aren't universal truths in the Bible. Do take the Bible very seriously, and I do think there are. But quite a lot of these things are a principle enacted within a context. And then for me, I've got to figure out, how do I take that principle and apply it in my context? So Paul takes the principle of a man leaving and two flesh becoming one, and applies it later to marriage in 1 Corinthians 7. And he talks about how you used to be able to say, like, that a man was master of a woman's body. But what he says is the man will be master of the woman's body and the woman will be master of the man's body, and both bodies are mastered by Christ, right? So he modifies it. He doesn't radically change it to what we might think of as an equal marriage, but he modifies it slightly and goes, in this context, now that you know that Christ actually is the master of all of us, and I'm using that word because that's the Greek word, is master in there. But now that you know that he's the master of everybody, anything is beneficial for me, he says, but I will be mastered by nothing. Because the idea is I'll just be mastered by Christ. I won't be ruled by my lust. I won't be ruled by what the world says. I'll be ruled by Christ. And inside of that, when you're married then, you both look after one another. Because you're both actually bending to Christ's will rather than your own, which isn't a massive revolution, but compared to the Roman rule of patria potestas and your husband can do anything to you, it's a little tweak of like, maybe we consider people as humans.
Just as a bare minimum.
So then I wouldn't want to model my household on the Ephesians 5 household or the Matthew 19 household, because these are households where the man rules everything and slavery is okay and children don't get to speak. And, these aren't households that we would think of as equitable, but I can take the principle of, respect is important, commitment is important. In Matthew 19, what Jesus is doing is saying, you have to look after your wife. You cannot neglect someone. They are a person who needs respect and help, and go, what does that mean in my context? Now,
someone contacted me this week and asked me what I thought I was doing. Not in that tone of voice.
What do you think you're doing, Simon?
And what I think we're trying to do in these 2 Binfire episodes is say, when we hear the word marriage, and now I'm going, marriage. When we hear that word, there's so much that floods in behind that word. And when we hear it in a Bible context or in a, medieval context, we just automatically fill in the blanks and make all kinds of assumptions. And those are not good assumptions to make.
Right.
So when Paul is writing about marriage and we have Jesus talk, they're not talking about what we understand as marriage. And it can be very problematic. The episode that I did about the history was just trying to say, even when you go to church, and a decreasing number of people do, and you go to a church service and the church talks as if, well, marriage is what we do. And, by some terrible flaw of secularism, other people are allowed to do it, but marriage is our thing. Even that is not true. And we're not trying to say anything about monogamy or faithfulness or the importance of sex in relationships. We're just trying to say, when people use the word marriage and connect it especially to the Bible, sometimes they do violence to the Bible and to the people that they're talking to.
Because people speak on it, preachers speak on it with such authority. And so, with so much zeal, and when you speak on something like that is weighted in patriarchy and patriarchal ideas, and when you use texts like this, which were derived from arch-patriarchy, which are source texts, when you use that kind of thing and go, this is how it's always been, so this is how it is, and anything that deviates from that is just de facto immoral. And when you do that, like Simon says, you're doing a violence to the text, but you're also making yourself responsible for the people who are going to hear that and who haven't got the background or the knowledge, or haven't had a group of people like yourselves who are able to counter that knowledge. And, you know, people don't have, it's not a fair fight. And so when people are trapped when people are trapped in marriages that are unhelpful, and they're feeling the weight of this passage, for example, on divorce, and they're saying, well, I mean, I've just got to suck it up. It doesn't matter. And yes, it's like Simon says, there are principles that like we can derive that are positive, that are like, you know, it's about protection as well. But that's not how they're preached about necessarily today. They're used to further an agenda, which is not the Bible's agenda.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? Like we're trying, as we were doing this, as we were putting all this together, to think about kind of ourselves and where we've got to in our lives, but also our friends that we know, and where life just maybe hasn't worked the way that this perfect ideal has. And what do you do then? So like, if this has worked for you, genuinely, I'm really glad. Like I have wonderful friends. I just conducted my first marriage ceremony. I really like love. And it's great. And when it works, and it has worked, if your church is really supportive, if you've got a really healthy relationship, I don't think that any of us are trying to undermine that.
No, absolutely not.
But what do we do in the world where it doesn't work or it isn't working? How do we find what is good and godly in that? And again, I mean, I'm talking personally, right? I wanted and got married young, not young actually, I was 23 and I was very serious and I knew exactly what I was doing and I loved my husband and he is a great man and it didn't work. And now I'm out the other side of it. And if the only thing that works is this one particular thing, then I've broken that. And there's a part of you that goes, well, if I'm going to be punished for that breaking forever, because now I've failed at this marriage thing, and the word failure came up in towards the end of your episode, Simon. If I've failed, then is it even worth me trying to find a Christian ethic? Should I just go off and do, like people set up this black and white stuff, and we're going, well, actually, maybe there's a way to find some really good godly things that aren't necessarily exactly the way it works. But that feeling of failure was really big for me. That I had failed at something massive, something so big, and I had people tell me that I was untrustworthy as a Christian leader anymore because my marriage had failed. As though my entire personality and all my knowledge and all my training and my 20 years experience came down to, could I sustain a marriage? And if I couldn't, then everything else is out of the window. That's how much of an idol people have made marriage into, and it's madness, the idea that I would be written off just because one thing in my life didn't work right, But it felt like that. And when I was trying to find a church, when I moved up here, I didn't really know how to. The only reason I moved to Leeds was because I was getting divorced. So I didn't have another story to tell. And I felt really exposed trying to go to churches and have to say, oh, well, I've moved up here because I'm getting divorced. It felt shameful. It felt like a failure. It felt like I had done something really awful, really awful. And there's a sort of assumption that people are going to ask you why, so that you can tell them and they can decide whether your divorce is a righteous one or an unrighteous one. And whether, if you can say adultery, people will always let you off, but partly maybe because of this Matthew verse. But if it's just that you were miserable, like that was not good enough, you've just failed at being the best Christian. It is a heavy weight to carry.
But also, it's probably part of the reason why, I've been in a relationship for nearly 8 years, and the reason why I'm probably no closer to getting married, even though, I'm in Christian adjacent circles, and our relationship's ancient compared to some of the relationships that my friends have been in, and they're already married. And I'm because it's a huge deal, and all of this stuff that it comes with of being someone's property and all this kind of stuff. I'm just it's a big thing.
Yeah, I think the thing that's funny for me is that when we say, oh, this stuff is all about property, in the Old Testament, we talk about it and people are thinking, oh, but yeah, it's like legal, but it's like sort of spiritual, they can spiritualize it a bit. And then it's like, no, in British law, women are chattel into the 20th century. This is not this is not a kind of philosophical category of property. It's a very literal category. Mary Wollstonecraft, who is the great
Legend.
kind of first feminist thinker, absolute legend, vindication of the rights of women. She's Mary Shelley's, who wrote Frankenstein. It's her mother. And she refuses
Really?
to get married.
Sorry.
Yes, it's her mother. Yeah.
That's a great fact.
In the 1750s, she says, no, I'm not getting married, and I won't get married because I will be no man's property.
Yeah.
And the moment she gets married, she becomes somebody's property. So we've been having this argument as well about what marriage is for women
Yeah.
for a really long time. But yeah, just in case people think it's a kind of like, we're going to talk patriarchy in the next episode, but we're just going like, it's a patriarchal construct that men think of women as property. It's like, no, we're legally property. That is just a legal category for women.
It was an idea manifested in law.
In law, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely established and was real. And so for women, it's only a few generations ago. So for women to be saying, maybe I don't want to get married because I don't want to feel like property, is not an overreaction in lots of ways.
No.
It's a real worry.
Yeah.
Because there's a strong argument that love marriage can't exist really without equality between the partners, because if there is any sort of imbalance, financial or cultural imbalance, then that's weighting it.
Well, I know people now who are afraid to leave their partners because they have children and they don't know how to look after their children. Weirdly now in law, marriage gives you a bit more safety of some of those things than not being married if you have children. But people still do this. And there's a reason that, our mother's generation started divorcing in the kind of divorce rates go up in the 70s. Yeah, because equal pay comes in, because you can get a credit card, because you can get a mortgage, because you can do these things that before then, it's impossible to leave your husband if you're going to be left with nothing and you're destitute.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of women for lots of years stayed with men because they had nothing. And this is partly what Jesus is addressing. I mean, that's how long it took, 2,000 years. Jesus is addressing in Matthew 19, you can't just divorce your wife because she'll be left destitute. It's not okay to leave a woman destitute. Now, would we all have liked him to have said, it's not okay to have a legal system that allows women to be left destitute? Yes, but unfortunately, he speaks as he finds.
3 years to overturn all that would have been quite a feat, I think.
Yeah.
I'm literally in the middle of trying to work out whether I think marriage is a salvageable idea. It's like I've dumped the word evangelical. I'm close to dumping the word Christian. Is the word marriage just not, do you know what I mean? Not actually salvageable in terms of what we're talking about?
Yeah. Good. I like you being the most radical person on the word marriage. Stick there.
I was going to say, I feel quite defensive of, like, when it's good, it's great. And, like, I don't know the ins and outs of my parents' marriage, and I can't claim to. But, the model that we were shown and the experience that I had being raised by two seemingly happily married people was a great experience. And I feel like part of me wants to be like, I think marriage is salvageable, but we just have to be honest about where it comes from and what it's, derived from. And I think part of that is, if you're going to make that decision, being able to have those conversations of, that we've been having over the past couple of months of, like, last names and where this, and what this comes from, and legally what happens when we are joined in this way. But I think, I don't know, I feel like I want to root for it at the same time as be skeptical of it.
I think you're right, though. I think this is the joy of this series for me, is opening the conversation or lancing the boil or whatever you want to think of it as. Because for me, and I've always been a feminist, I was raised a feminist, I was raised in those ways, being honest about it means you can have something good. Two people in this podcast are married. Like, this is that I liked my marriage. Oh, I was not, like, upset with getting married. I don't regret it at all. It just went wrong at the end. But yeah, like, we have to have these, be a bit more open about this and a bit more honest about it, because that's when you can find the good stuff, I guess. It just means that to some people, it sounds like we're really negative all the time, but we're really not.
Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to make sure you don't miss an episode. Episodes are released every other Monday, and the next episode in the series is on Monday 22nd of December. As our bonus seasonal gift to you, we are finally calling out the problematic thread that has run through each of our episodes. That's right, it's Patriarchy Week. Lastly, a reminder, If you'd like to support the project, make sure you share it with your friends and family. And as always, you can patronise us by subscribing to agodwecouldbelievin.substack.com. Here you'll also receive bonus episodes and regular reflections from Simon and the team right to your inbox. We will see you again very soon.